Drive with Doc, the day never ended. We may get home at 10, may get home at 11, still spay a cat or two, but he asked me one day, he said, so is Dr. Smalley your father? And I said, no sir, I just have a good time with him. When if I can have a good time, maybe that's what I want to do in life. And he said, that's a good enough reason. He had a good time doing what he did, so I want to go over some of those things, but believe me, there's two people in this world that if they asked me to get up and say a little about, it'd be Chester W. Taylor or Dr. H.R. Smalley, because they are the two that have been the biggest impact on me, and obviously I have been the one that got the most out of it. Chester W. Taylor Jr. I think pretty much everybody in here probably knows Dad to some extent. I guess what you'll probably see in the course of the night is, understand I was born in 1956. So, I don't know a whole lot about Dad's childhood. I do know that he was born in Sanford, Florida, September the 24th, 1924. He had a sister born March 27th, 1926. That will come into play a little bit later, and that's why I introduced that. Dad and his only sibling went to Alabama because that's where Gramps, or Chester W. Taylor Sr., was in the military. He did come back to Dade City and had the mobile station, which was on the corner, catty corner from Huckabee Chevrolet. It was the GMC, Pontiac dealer. So he had that station, and that's where, he got started. But everybody pretty much knew Annieolas because Taman Johnson, Williams, it didn't matter. Annie could fit in and work in Dade City because everybody loved her as well. We lived on 312 Park Street. That's in Dade City. Used to be right across from the Jackson Memorial Hospital. Every night I'd hear that tornado squealing, tires turning in, and it'd be Dr. Deal coming in to treat emergencies. But by God, he was good. I mean, he was on call as much as we were, but obviously on the human side. So growing up on 312 Park Street, it kind of, starts to put things in perspective. Dad, which we'll go over in a second, obviously was a school superintendent. So we were on 312 Park Street for the first 6 years. All I had to do was go 1 block south and I'd be at Pasco Elementary School. Walk there every day, walk back. You could still get in trouble, especially if your brother was rusty, because there was a lot to do in between 1 block. But then, even for middle school, all I had to do was go 1 block south. Then, things happened a little later, which we'll go over, when Pasco High, which originally, was where the middle school is, moved out on the big hill. So I guess I was started out right, so I could just walk to school and not be a problem, and I think that's like what Mom and Dad really liked. Dad loved Dade City, and he loved Pasco County, but he loved education. He was very instrumental in keeping the county seat, which we all know the value of the county seat because we don't have it anymore. It's on the west side. But that's what, as a kid, you hear all these things, being talked about by grown-ups, but you really, you don't totally understand. But, Dad, his office was in the old courthouse at the northeast end. Ted Williams, tax assessor, pretty important man, right across. Okay, There's a reason for those two being in those particular places. You know, when he would mention, you know, the West Coast, he would never really cuss, but he really, you know, wanted to emphasize, yes, that's where growth is, that's where numbers are. Numbers are what drive politicians and money for backing up things. But he, luckily, until he was, you know, out of his 4th term as school superintendent, was able to keep the county seat on this side of the county. You know, I can remember, you know, as a kid, you know, probably Mom wanted Rusty and I out of the house, so Dad would take us, you know, to the old courthouse, and he just locked both ends, because he knowed if we got out, we'd get in trouble. But we still had a lot of fun. You know, we go up in the old clock, and, you know, we did things that, you know, probably you wouldn't have got done during the week, but we had right up and down the elevator. And then, you know, it was a different town back then. Things happen that, you know, you just don't have the chance these days. But I can remember one day, you know, when Rusty and I were there with Dad, and there came a banging on the east doors. And it was a couple of guys dressed up as cowboys, and they go, "Chester, come on out." And Chester said, "No, I'm not coming out." You know, Rusty and I are just going, "Whoa, this is crazy." You know, and they popped off a couple of blanks. "Chester, come on out." Well, what it was back in those days, Wilbur Dew and the gang would ride around Dade City. They would take to prison certain people so that they would have to pay to get out of, to raise money.
Oh my Lord.
Wilbur called everybody in Dade City to get a key to that courthouse, and finally about 5 o'clock, he walked Dad down to the little makeshift jail, and then Dad had to pay to get out. Just probably, you know, like I say, you know, childhood, you gotta understand, this was something that I happened upon because, you know, being at the clinic, we see a lot of, you know, clients, but we see a lot of people, which we enjoy. Mr. Futch, who worked in the courthouse, he came in one day with this piece of paper, and he said, "Chet, I just thought you might want this, you know, because we're all going to computers and we're all putting things on, you know, discs. This is an original ballot that is literally 1956, November the 6th. So you say, okay, so what's the significance there? 1956. If you go to right here, it says Chester W. Taylor running as a Democrat for school superintendent. He ran against Mr. Sinclair. Mr. Sinclair was the incumbent who had been superintendent for a long time, but he got a little bit lazy. He didn't realize that the young guy, you know, that grew up, went through Pasco, went to the University of Florida, came back and taught. He taught business and shorthand. Well, that young man decided that he liked to go a little bit further, so he would like to be school superintendent. So Mr. Sinclair went and did a little more fishing, whereas Dad did a little more politicking. I mean, he literally walked Newport Richie with Mom, you know, with Nanny, with Gramps, with everybody. It's not like today. You can't push a mouse and send all these things out to, you know, so many people, or have, you know, those funds that, you know, back, you know, certain candidates and that kind of thing. But back in the day, you know, when Dad first got into it, they had to hit the ground running. Luckily, that was when Dad won his first term in 1956, November, and started his career as school superintendent. Well, understand, if I was born December 26, 1956, I wasn't even born yet, okay? So I didn't know about it for a long, long time. And that was one of the things about Dad. You know, everybody, you know, thinks they know, you know, everything. But one thing Dad never really did, you know, was talk.
Year I moved to Dade.
You know, and explain, you know, some of the things that he did do that were pretty exciting. Don't, you know, have a lot of things, but I got a couple of his, I want to just pass them around because I think it's pretty darn neat. These are, for his election, his little cards that he went and passed out and gained. So just, if you would pass them around to everybody, because take your time to read them. I think it's, you know, one of the steps, you know, that Dad was in, but showed, you know, things are a little bit different back then than they are, you know, today. To kind of just, I gotta set kind of the stage. So what I want to do is, as a young individual, you know, all we knew was Kiefer's, go down there, you know, get the fountain, go to the armory, play a little basketball, you know, go to Pasco Theater for 25 cents. We were out of Mom and Dad's hair. But somewhere along the way, I guess you just didn't hear some of the many things that Dad did. So to kind of just start it off, this is the District School Board of Pasco County. Proclamation recognizing the history of Chester W. Taylor. Whereas the Pasco County School Board recognizes Chester W. Taylor Jr., longtime educator, child advocate, and former superintendent. Whereas Chester Taylor was born in Sanford, raised in Dade City, Florida, and was a loving husband of Vera Russell and the proud father of 4 children. Whereas Chester was a combat veteran of World War II, served during the Korean War as an infantry training officer at Fort Jackson. Whereas Chester Taylor began his teaching career at Pasco High, where he taught business and handwriting. Whereas Chester Taylor served as superintendent of the district school of Pasco County from 1956 to 1972. Whereas Chester Taylor's tenure as superintendent included the oversight of the desegregation of the public schools. I'm going to stop a little bit there because it just, as a kid, you kind of don't realize some of the things that your parents are going through. Dad was not only superintendent for 3.5 terms, you know, because he resigned at the end of his 4th term, but he was school superintendent at one of the times that were probably, I mean, I know we think things are crazy today. Back then, when they brought desegregation and forced busing to Chester Taylor, he said, county focused Pasco, ex-superintendent held line on busing. Chester W. Taylor walked into the crowded 1-room cabin in the dark woods of Lacoochee. So with all that was going on, Dad, and this is the story that you're, you know, thinking about, was approached by the Grand Dragon of the KKK and said, Mr. Taylor, you know, we want to have a little talk with you. Well, what are you going to tell them? You're not going to go meet them? So they met him at the courthouse, put a cloak over his head, drove him out to a place in Lacoochee that obviously he didn't know where it was, out in, you know, Cummers. Went way back into a little abandoned schoolhouse. They put him at the end. Okay, you came in here, there's no exit there. They pulled the cloak off of him and they said, Mr. Taylor, what we want to know is, what is your stand on this? And he said, we will not let anybody tell us that we will use forced busing to force desegregation. Grand Dragon stood up and he said, Mr. Taylor, I've got 3 of my grandkids in the Coochie Elementary School. He said, I want to see them get an education. We will back you 100%, anything you need. Put the cloak back on him, put him in the car, brought him back to the courthouse. That was definitely, you know, one of the times that, you know, he probably was a little bit concerned, but then obviously Tallahassee got word that Chester W. Taylor was not going to comply with federal regulation of forced busing for desegregation. So an attorney came down from Atlanta. Dad went and met him in Zephyr Hills. He said, what's up? He goes, Mr. Taylor, he said, it's very simple. We hear that you're the school superintendent of Pasco County. You're not going to comply with federal rules, and so we're going to pull your federal funding. He said, that's not a problem. He said, what do you mean? He said, I've already talked to all my people. They will support these schools with private funds, and we will continue on. He shook his hand, and there was only one county in this state, and you can look it up on record, that did not comply with their regulations, but it is still in existence and still one of the best county school systems that there is. I'm just, you know, as a kid, you know, you hear, you know, probably not to, you know, get off the subject, but, you know, Dad wakes up in the morning, and probably the morning that kind of got Rusty and I off, you know, to a bad start right first thing in the morning, is when Dad came in and he said, John F. Kennedy has been shot. You know, we're just kids, but that don't sound good. You know, President of the United States been shot, you know. But to this day, you know, as much as he did with the military, and we'll go over a little bit more of that in a minute, they never said, did you know what I did? They did it. They didn't talk about it. They didn't have to be patted on the back. It was just the way that things were done. I don't know if you remember, in 1968 was the statewide teacher walkout. They said, if this is the only way we're going to be able to work it out, Dad said, I'll tell every one of you right now, anybody that walks out, I'll fire you and I'll replace you. They didn't believe him. They walked out, he fired them and replaced them and kept the school system going. So, you know, many years later, you know, I'm been there working for Doc, and I'm in the room, and Anna Kirkland comes in. She was a school teacher back in '68, and she walked, and she got fired. So she worked in Hillsborough from that point on. She said, you know what? I don't have anything against your dad. He told us what he was going to do, and he did it. I said, Miss Kirkland, I said, you know, I wasn't there, but it sounds like he kind of told you. So she said, well, that's what we thought we needed to do, but it was always fun when she'd bring, you know, her little, you know, white dog in. We'd always get on, you know, what happened back in those days. Ma'am?
I said, I wonder where he found all those teachers.
I can tell you, you can read it, he did it. It's called substitutes. You take substitutes and you put them in there, and by gosh, sometimes they're just as good as the one teaching because they're maybe a little hungry, maybe they want to be there, but they also learn that, if Chet Taylor said something, maybe we might need to listen. So let me get back to this. I gotta read a few more of these to try to keep in line. All right, whereas Chester Taylor, a lifelong learner, continued his career at St. Leo College as the Dean of the Military Education Program. We'll get into that in a minute. Whereas a school located at 36328 Morris Bridge Road in Zephyr Hills was officially opened on August 25th, 1997. With an enrollment of 630 students, and the district school board named this school in honor of the former superintendent, Chester W. Taylor. There's times when you get rewarded for what you do. Jeannie Larkin was very instrumental, and I appreciate everything that she and the school board did, because they named that school after Dad while he was still alive. So number one, he got to go to the ceremony, which was a very nice ceremony, got the tour of it, and would go back for graduations, and the kids got a kick out of it. He got a kick out of being there. The question, get answered, I ask every once in a while, well, why didn't they name a high school after him? Well, back in that particular time was one of the few times Pasco wasn't growing like it is today. They didn't need a high school. So the only thing you could get if you want to name it after your dad, or not us, but they had, but he enjoyed the elementary school, as much as it had been a high school. Miss McCrimmon, she was the principal. She would always, keep him up, on everything that was going on. Totally enjoyed going over there. My sister, she set up, 2 scholarships for teachers, in my mom's name, and, that, worked out good as well. Just to kind of explain a few things, if you go back in the 70s, which, was already brought up, in 1970, Mom passed away unexpectedly. She was struggling with systemic lupus erythematosus, which is an autoimmune disease. I told you Dad had one sibling. She was a sport. We would go up and visit her. She married Hugh Papworth. They lived in upstate New York, outside of Mexico. We would go up there, some summers and help them with hay and whatever. And then obviously they loved to come down and visit, the cousins in Florida, because we had everything. In 1971, Dad's sister was at the kitchen sink doing dishes and had an aneurysm and died. So if you look at the timeline, all I'm doing is not being sad, but Dad had been a school superintendent for 3 terms, elected for the 4th term. In 1972 is when he said, I want something else. He had Rusty and myself, and that was bad enough, so he wanted to get the heck out of Dodge. But I think you can see the impact that the 70s had on him, even though he had accomplished all the things that we've gone over. So he decided, I want to, change things up, maybe travel a little bit. He went and worked for Burt Rogers School of Real Estate. teaching students how to get their real estate license, and obviously probably today they have done darn well, because back then, if you got started then, you know, Florida's been selling ever since. But in the state of Florida, he had 6,000 students in Burt Rogers School of Real Estate, which you can Google them. They're still in existence, still do a heck of a good job. After 2.5 years, he decided, I don't want to do that much traveling. You know, not that there was anything to keep him home. Rusty and I had kind of halfway grown up, and, you know, was going to Pasco Hernando, which if you go back and look at one of the things that's not mentioned in the proclamation, was Chester Taylor was very fundamental to the starting of Pasco Hernando Community College, now called Pasco Hernando State College. Loved Milton O. Jones, and then, you know, the story goes from there. You know, I was fortunate enough to go to Pasco Elementary, Middle School, and then high school, and then because my brother, you know, he came home one day and he said, you know, you're digging ditches in groves. I said, yeah, it's a living. You know, I was only 13, but I had a motorcycle and you could drive a motorcycle back then. He goes, you know, I worked for Dr. Smalley. He said, but I don't want to work there all my life. And I said, okay. He said, you want me to go introduce you? I said, sure. So he takes me in there. He says, Doc, this is my little brother. He said, you know, I appreciate everything you've done for me, but he said, oh, this just isn't for me. He said, but he might, you know, be looking for a job. Smalley looked at me and he said, get a haircut. Went the next day and got a haircut, and I've never left him since. But what that takes us up to is Burt Rogers School of Real Estate, you know, was one of those stepping stones, and Dad, he loved education and the process of it. So then the next opportunity came up, and it's truly, obviously he loved being a school superintendent, a teacher, an educator, and everything, but this combined the two things that Dad loved the most, and that was not only education, but the military. The military education program at St. Leo was in its infancy. They called Chester Taylor. He said, I'll be more than happy to. He loved Dr. Robert Southard because that was in the early 70s, and St. Leo was not doing real well at that particular time. They weren't a land grant college, you know, they were a private college, depended on tuition and everything from a lot of northern, you know, kids that came down because beautiful setting, beautiful college, Catholic college. But Dad took the military education program and ran with it. Now he's in charge of so many more. His 6 southeastern states were from Norfolk News, Virginia, down to Key West, over to Pensacola, and everything in between. He would travel to those bases because he had been in the military, World War II and the Korean conflict, but stayed in the reserve and, you know, helped at the armory. So now he's totally in his, you know, glory, because he's got both of them. Now these kids, you know, whether it was the GI Bill or no matter what it was, they could be on a destroyer in the Asian Sea and take a class and get an education, but still be serving the country. So the military education program rocketed you know, just like, you know, some of the other people we did that took, you know, advantage of computers, you know, and that kind of thing. After